The name's Sherlock Holmes and the address is 221B Baker Street.
If my little creation of Sherlock Holmes has survived longer than he deserved, said Arthur Conan Doyle. And I consider it's very largely due to those gentlemen who've associated themselves with him.
Knowledge of anatomy, accurate but unsystematic.
Plays the violin well.
Knowledge of chemistry, profound.
For over 100 years, more than 80 actors have put a varying face to the world's greatest consulting detective, Sherlock Holmes, each of them drawing on the distinct attributes of this most enigmatic of characters.
Knowledge of philosophy, nil.
Is an expert single-stick player, boxer and swordsman.
Has a good practical knowledge of British law.
Sherlock Holmes was the first detective to be transferred to the screen, and his appearances chart the evolution of film itself, from silent two-reelers or quickies to the marvel of color, and up to the latest electronic wizardry. In fact, our notion of Sherlock Holmes today is as much a creation of the various film and television performances as from the stories themselves. Join us as we examine and, of course, deduce the ever-changing face of Sherlock Holmes. Two men traveling by train between Cardiff and London in 2006 hit upon the novel idea for a modern resetting of Sherlock Holmes. One that would free him from the trappings of Victoriana and allow us to see the stories as they were originally experienced, exciting, cutting-edge and contemporary. The two men on the train were Stephen Moffat and Mark Gatiss, already well known for their work on Doctor Who.
I said, isn't it odd that in the original story, A Study in Scarlet, Dr. Watson is invalided home from military service in Afghanistan, and it's the same war as we were then fighting. And it was just a kind of light bulb moment where it was like, well, we should do that again.
And in 2010, Sherlock hit our screens. It reinvigorated this iconic character for a whole new audience.
It's interesting when you ask people about who their favourite Sherlock Holmes is, because I have this theory that your favourite Sherlock Holmes is the one really that you grew up with. People of a certain age will always answer Rathbone as their favourite, just as they did Jeremy Brett with those who were growing up in the 80s. And I suspect young people, when you ask them, their answer is going to be Benedict Cumberbatch.
This modern retelling set out to keep the spirit of the original stories, yet completely transform them for the digital age.
What are you typing?
Blog.
About?
Us.
You mean me?
Why?
Well, you're typing a lot.
We live in a world of micro-blogging, which is a fantastic and perfect parallel for the idea of Dr. Watson serializing his adventures. We've started sending telegrams again in the form of texts. We were able to draw immediate and exact parallels between the original stories and the idea of updating it.
John.
Rhododendron ponticum.
Batches. He remains modern now, yet there is something of an old soul about him, something old-fashioned about him, something well removed, slightly sociopathic, slightly, so rigorous and thorough that he gets castigated as being cut off. I think it borderlines in our version on someone with people who have Asperger's and maybe slightly mild autism as well. And a lot of that is to do with taking control of chaos. And that means cutting out human sentiment. That means being able to think incredibly rationally and scythe through any kind of pretense.
He's not gay. Why do you have to spoil? He's not.
With that level of personal grooming?
Because he puts a bit of product in his hair. I put product in my hair.
Wash your hair, there's a difference. No, tinted eyelashes, clear signs of taurine cream around the frown lines, those tired crabber's eyes. Then there's his underwear.
His underwear?
Visible above the waistline, very visible, very particular brand.
I remember the first sort of press conference. All our answers were there to rebut the questions, how can you do this without hansom cabs and fog? And our whole argument was that it had become all about those. It was all about the trappings. It was literally lost in the fog.
By the end of the second series, the new Sherlock had built up a huge following, but the British public was in for a shock.
Goodbye, John.
No, don't.
Sherlock's fall to his death put the public in the same hiatus as it had done 120 years before. In 1893, Sherlock Holmes author Arthur Conan Doyle pushed him and Professor Moriarty over the Reichenbach Falls, and the whole nation mourned. There was an outcry in the press. It said that men wore black crepe armbands, and legend reports that 20,000 people cancelled their subscription to the Strand magazine in which the stories were published. Doyle was vilified for what he'd done, and even attacked in the street. But what is it about this inscrutable hero that elicits such strong feelings both then and now?
The most important thing about Sherlock Holmes is that what he was doing was new in the form in which he did it, and immensely popular, as if there was some need for this kind of reading that had until now not been met.
Of course, there'd been detective stories by Edgar Allan Poe and the French detective Arsène Lupin, very famous in France, and others, but none had had the impact of the stories about Holmes. He had a brain which seemed to be more varied in knowledge and ability and deduction than anyone else. He was unique. He still is.
Such was the furore over Holmes' Reichenbach fall that in 1901 Conan Doyle was forced to bring him back. Little could he have realized then that Holmes would step off the page and live on forever in a brand new cultural medium. His return and the subsequent rise in his appeal coincided with the coming of film. Right from the dawn of cinema, writers, directors, and above all actors would more than embrace the character of Sherlock Holmes.
It has become one of the great parts to play that relaxed control and still be just leagues ahead of everybody else. Never really in danger.
There is a temperature and speed of thought and ferocity to him, which I find difficult to change into. It's the thing I try to make look natural, but anyone who's worked with him on the show will tell you it's not.
Sherlock Holmes is two things. He's a man of action, and he's also a man of deep thought. And these are two things that actors love to latch onto, because when you play Sherlock Holmes, you can do all sorts of running and fighting. But then you've also got those moments of calculation. You've got those moments where the camera comes in towards the face of that brooding actor, where we get right into the thoughts of this man, and we get to see something mysterious flickering across his eyes.
I think the screen on the whole has done it pretty well. It's managed to find actors who are good actors and look rather like, because after all these stories were illustrated, and by a good illustrator we know what Sherlock looks like or should look like.
It was the story's original illustrator, Sidney Paget, who created the first visual depiction of Sherlock Holmes. It was Paget who gave Holmes his deerstalker hat and his Inverness cape, details that were never mentioned in Conan Doyle stories.
The Paget drawings are sort of ingrained. They just are. That silhouette and the image of the deerstalker, and it's as iconic as any of the stories, really.
In drawing him so distinctly for a vast readership, Paget not only secured Holmes something approaching national emblem status, like John Bull or even Britannia, but also provided a visual template for future actors playing the part. And the story of Sherlock Holmes on screen really begins with Sherlock Holmes on stage. The first prominent actor to play Holmes was an American matinee idol, William Gillette, in his own version, Sherlock Holmes, a drama in 4 acts. The actor Tim Pigott-Smith played Dr. Watson in the first major revival of Gillette's play in the 1970s.
Gillette was an absolutely archetypal Victorian actor-manager. That particular role doesn't really exist now, but then it was the way the theatre worked.
And like the Paget illustrations, Gillette added new elements to the character that endure to this day.
In the Paget drawings, Holmes is smoking a straight pipe, and Gillette introduced the curved pipe. The theory is that it was better for the mouth, that the audience could see him more clearly. And of course, the famous phrase, "Elementary, my dear Watson," was also an invention of Gillette's. He toured the play extensively. He brought it to England, where the young Charles Chaplin, aged 11, played Billy the page boy. He made a lot of money out of it. It was phenomenally successful.
The play would serve as a blueprint for future film versions, especially after William Gillette committed his famous stage performance to film in 1916. The film, alas, is now lost, and only these few production stills survive. But it presented for the first time on screen the popular image of Sherlock Holmes, with all the accessories and phrases that Paget and Gillette had given him, and which many, if not all, subsequent actors playing Holmes have adopted. The first Sherlock Holmes film started in earnest in 1921, made by Stoll Picture Productions in the unlikely setting of Cricklewood. With the curiously named Eillie Norwood as Sherlock Holmes.
Eillie Norwood's real name was Anthony Brett. He changed his name, so he always said, because he'd once been in love with a girl called Eileen, or Eillie, and he'd lived in Norwood, and he put these two things together. Tricky to do Sherlock Holmes on the silent screen because it depends so much upon those set-piece explanations of how things happened. What Norwood did was concentrate upon staging the idea of Holmes' thinking, so much so that he even had his head shaved up to the temples in order to make himself look more intellectual.
The Norwood series of films also began the trend of placing Holmes in a new era. They went in for a contemporary 1920s setting. This was Holmes for the modern age. And one of their highlights was in their use of real locations. But how would Arthur Conan Doyle, who was still writing Holmes stories set in period, react to such a modernizing approach?
Conan Doyle gave it his official stamp of approval. They met and they toasted each other and gave each other grateful thanks. So he is the first screen Holmes to really come with the proper official endorsement of Holmes's creator.
Following Eillie Norwood's impressive and successful run of 47 silent quickies, Sherlock Holmes now became a staple subject for the cinema. But over the next few years, the performances on screen tended to be slow and over-studious affairs, only Arthur Wantner's authentic Paget-like performance making any real impression.
And me. So elementary, my dear Watson.
What Sherlock needed was the film star treatment. And in 1939, with Europe on the brink of war and cinema audiences eager for escapist adventure, he would get just that. Sherlock Holmes was about to be reimagined by Hollywood. And the actor who took up the challenge and went on to define it was, of course, Basil Rathbone.
Oh, Professor Moriarty. Not that I wish to appear...
On the screen, for me, the perfect Holmes, Basil Rathbone.
With Rathbone, he just had a great elegance and charm. He was very smooth and cool with it. He was sort of a Bond figure.
And it's always been Rathbone. And then when I think of the other ones, I tend to sort of superimpose Rathbone on it, really.
Every time people look at him on screen and think, not does this accord with the Arthur Conan Doyle stories, but does this accord with the Holmes that's in my imagination? And I think that's where Rathbone was particularly successful. He looked like Holmes. He was lean physique, he had a sharp profile, he had a confident manner and, of course, incisive English accent. And he had that almost arrogant air that people associate with Holmes.
A whole day and a night have gone by since that festive affair in Edgware Road.
Rathbone manages to capture that cool, ascetic, calm, thinking mind. I suppose there is something slightly autistic, we might say now, about Holmes, a lack of connection with feeling, which was one of the things that makes him so compelling.
20th Century Fox's The Hound of the Baskervilles was to be the very first big-budget Sherlock Holmes movie, and surprisingly, it was the first Sherlock Holmes film to be set in period, as a Victorian gaslit adventure was felt to be at a comfortable distance for audiences from the realities of impending war. Rathbone had been chosen personally for the part by the studio boss himself, Darrell F. Zanuck.
Zanuck had a very hands-on approach. He wanted Holmes to be a clever, observing fellow, not the sort of chap who pulled rabbits out of the hat. So in other words, he wanted it to be about deduction.
But Zanuck's control also extended to the script, and there was one line that he mysteriously added, which would, for the first time on film, mention Sherlock Holmes' most controversial vice, his cocaine habit.
The very last line, as Rathbone goes out of the room to go, he opens a door to go into another room. He says, "Watson, the needle."
Oh, Watson, the needle.
The line contravened the Hays Code, Hollywood's moral censorship guide, which dictated what could and could not be mentioned on screen.
There was actually a specific line where you had to tick to say that you had not referred to narcotics. The needle is all over the press book for Hound of the Baskervilles. And in fact, there is a wonderful figure of Watson. He's struggling under the weight of a giant syringe, and the caption says, "Watson, the needle."
Watson! Coming home!
And it was in these films, too, that the character of Dr. Watson finally caught up with Holmes to take equal billing on screen for the first time.
Thank you for your timely assistance. Really, Watson, aren't you a little stout for this sort of thing? Rubbish. Ideal weight for a man of my age.
The character of Watson is certainly not what Dr. Watson was. Played by Nigel Bruce, it's unforgettable and extremely funny.
What you get there is a sense of these figures being a double act, in the way, I suppose, that Abbott and Costello were a double act, or the way in which Bob Hope and Bing Crosby were a double act.
I say, Holmes? What? It's morning. Allow me to congratulate you on a brilliant bit of deduction.
And every time that Sherlock Holmes makes a deduction, Nigel Bruce with the Rathbone films always says, "Great Scott," which always amuses me. You know it's coming.
Watson! Great Scott! Great Scott, it's Jonathan Bleak. Great Scott, the guard. Great Scott, Holmes! Well, I'll be blown.
This new dynamic, introduced by the pairing of Holmes and Watson, with its comic potential, was to become central to all subsequent screen versions. Yet after only 2 films, 20th Century Fox, thinking they had bought the rights to the characters outright, were forced to drop the famous pair.
They were under threat of a lawsuit. This came from Arthur Conan Doyle's estate, which was being managed by his two sons, Adrian and Dennis Conan Doyle. And one Conan Doyle biographer has described them as spendthrift playboys. And they were out to milk as much as possible from the estate. So Holmes disappeared from the screen for 3 years, while Dennis Conan Doyle basically hawked it round all the studios.
And there was one studio that felt Sherlock Holmes would be ideal for them.
Now, Universal were very keen because at the time there were a lot of crime series and Universal didn't have one. And they bought up an option to produce 12 films over the next 7 years.
But Adrian and Dennis Conan Doyle also had various stipulations as to what could or could not be done to the character.
They couldn't kill off Holmes, they couldn't criminalise him, they couldn't make him look ridiculous, but they were allowed to modernise him. And that, of course, is exactly what they did.
The first in the Universal pictures was Sherlock Holmes and the Voice of Terror, set during World War II with Holmes and Watson up against the Nazis. This was an obvious and explicit patriotic war film.
Nothing prepared them for the opening shot of the film, which is a map of Europe with a shadow of a radio mast across it, and the voice of Lord Haw-Haw, or a Lord Haw-Haw sound-alike. This is the voice of terror, this is the voice you will fear. So suddenly, we're not just in the modern era, we are in the war.
Germany broadcasting, people of Britain, greetings from the Third Reich. This is the voice you have learned to fear. This is the voice of terror. Again,
at the end was a very moving speech by Holmes, a speech that was so successful that they commissioned similar speeches for the next 4 films.
There's an east wind coming all the same. Such a wind has never blew on England yet. It will be cold and bitter, Watson. And a good many of us may wither before its blast. But it's God's own wind nonetheless. And a greener, better, stronger land will lie in the sunshine when the storm is cleared.
Dennis Conan Doyle wrote to the studio, and the letter's here. It says he thinks the modern setting was a daring experiment. This is incomparably the best Sherlock Holmes film ever made. Now, we have to think about the fact that Dennis Conan Doyle was receiving $12,000 every time they made a film. I think this might have influenced his view of it.
There he is.
After 3 war-themed escapades, the series strayed into other genres for which the studio was well known. Firstly, into Gothic horror. And then pitting Holmes against a very different kind of arch-villain from Professor Moriarty, the femme fatale.
And this started with a film called Spider-Woman. During the war, millions of women had gone out to work, and there were genuine fears that when the war ended, women would not want to return to domesticity. So you got these clever, deadly, sexually attractive women trying to outwit Holmes. He described a crime that was particularly cruel, and he said he knew it was the work of a woman because he said it was feline, not canine.
The presence of a female nemesis introduced sexual tension into Holmes' world for the first time, and this was something that the recent series of Sherlock was keen to revisit, only now the femme fatale is transformed into a cunning dominatrix. For Sherlock, being beaten by a woman takes on a whole new meaning.
Oh, it's always hard to remember an alias when you've had a fright, isn't it? Well, there now. We're both defrocked. Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Miss Adler, I presume.
Oh, look at those cheekbones. I could cut myself slapping that face. Would you like me to try?
The character of Irene Adler holds a unique place in Holmes' affection, and it would seem a unique place amongst her own gender, as Holmes wistfully confides in the last of the Rathbone films.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I do hope you've given the woman a soul. She had one, you know.
By the woman, I suppose you mean Irene Adler.
Yes. I shall always remember her as the woman.
And yet, despite his huge success and continuing appeal, Rathbone felt typecast for the rest of his life as Sherlock Holmes. The only mystery I couldn't solve, he said shortly before his death, was the same one Conan Doyle had: how to get rid of the damn man. Rathbone cast a long silhouette. Who would be bold enough to don the deerstalker next? In 1959, Sherlock Holmes came home as the British Hammer Film Studio did what they did best in pumping new blood into a classic story. The trailer for the film showed expectant audiences a new and exciting Holmes for the very first time in rich, lurid Technicolor.
What do you want me to do? Identify anything I may find. Strange things are to be found on the moor. Like this, for instance.
I like the fact that it actually plays rather fast and loose with it. It introduces the idea of human sacrifice and some sort of Dartmoor black magic. Of course it does, it's a hammer. They were desperately striving to make it an X and only got as far as an A.
And reunited after their successful pairing in both Dracula and The Curse of Frankenstein were those two stollards of Hammer films, Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee.
He was a wonderful Holmes. He really was. He had a certain habit, Peter, which I used to kid him about, was the finger. And also he very much pronounced its consonants. And after the first take, so I said, there you go, the finger. Again, the finger. On no account, Sir Henry, are you to go out on the moor tonight?
Sir Henry, I am not a man to overestimate danger, but I must insist upon one thing. Under no circumstances are you to venture out onto the moor alone at night.
Oh, very well.
Cushing was a huge fan of Doyle and of Sherlock Holmes. He employed all his customary delicacy, subtlety, and his meticulous nature into the script and the performance. He changed lines which he felt were wrong. He put lines in. There was a line in the original script about what he was going to get paid, and he put in the line from Thor Bridge: "My professional charges are upon a fixed scale. I never vary them, save for when I remit them altogether."
You will not find me ungenerous in the matter of fees.
My professional charges are upon a fixed scale. I do not vary them, except when I remit them altogether. Good day.
Good day, Mr. Holmes.
He annotated his script with drawings. He wanted it to resemble as far as possible the Paget illustrations. I think he's clearly having a ball in that film. It's a very, very persuasive interpretation.
The problem with that film, and it's the major problem in that particular story, is the hound. Described in the book, if I remember correctly, being almost as big as a donkey.
With their limited, if enterprising, resources, Hammer had employed a Great Dane called Colonel and a production artist called Margaret to fashion a mask of latex and rabbit fur to create the Hound from Hell.
I was the one who was responsible for making the mask for the Hound of the Baskervilles. I was rather ashamed of the mask I made. It was the worst one I ever made, and the only one people know about. There's Colonel, the Hound. There he is on the miniature set, about to leap off onto Christopher Lee. Colonel was in trouble. There was a lawsuit. He'd bitten a barmaid and had a bad reputation for temper. So I was feeling rather apprehensive. However, the dog took one look at me, and if ever a dog fell in love at first sight, it was that dog. I was his sort of woman.
With such a temperamental dog, the thrilling climax at the Great Grimpen Mire had to be very carefully choreographed.
The dog would only allow me to put the mask on. I crouched behind a rock, holding the dog. A man called Danny, a prop man, had to climb a ladder, because the dog didn't like Danny, an inoffensive man. He also didn't like crumpled paper. So Danny had to crumple the paper at the bottom of the ladder, shin up quickly before the dog got to him.
And of course, by the time he was supposed to assault me, they had to goad him. And he did, in fact, grab me.
A small boy had been dressed in a replica of Christopher Lee's costume in order to make the dog look bigger. But the dog didn't like small boys. When the dog leaped towards little Robert, the boy, the look of terror was on his face.
When the hound is dead, shot by Holmes, he does lift the mask off the face to show why he was so terrifying.
They use this mask to make it look more terrifying. It was starved for weeks, kept down the mind till the time's ripe, then given the scent.
With the hound dead, so ended Hammer's brief foray into Baker Street. Possibly dismayed, they'd failed to gain an X certificate for their version of Conan Doyle's Gothic creeper. Hammer now went in search of other beasts to bolster their growing horror reputation. The Conan Doyle estate, now controlled solely by Adrian Conan Doyle, would have to look elsewhere for screen adaptations.
Adrian was not an easy man. Not at all. I mean, he lived off the name. He lived in a castle in Switzerland, which I think belonged either to his father or the trust. And he was the final arbiter, judge, of what could or could not go on the screen. If he didn't like it, they didn't shoot it.
4 years later, in 1963, Adrian entered into negotiations with the BBC for a major new series based on the stories, one that it was hoped would bring Holmes to a wide new television audience. Over 13 episodes, the actor Douglas Wilmer was to explore the darker recesses of the master detective with whom he sensed a connection.
Well, I felt a kinship with the character of Sherlock Holmes. I have a lot of characteristics in common with him. I'm extremely untidy, I'm very detailed, I tend to be obsessional, I get very depressed and black-humoured.
Those great jagged rocks. In a northerly wind, if I were a sailor, I would keep away from this place.
I am not sure, Holmes, that it is the place for you.
I find it delightful.
There is a savage melancholy in this Cornish landscape.
Which matches my mood. Exactly.
His black moods were accompanied by ill temper, lack of consideration, exasperation with the world in general, and in particular with there not being enough crime about to satisfy him.
Another day abandoned to the pursuit of pleasure. Is there nothing of any interest in the papers?
A possible revolution in Spain. Trouble in Africa. Oh, the government could be turned out over Home Rule.
I was referring to crime, Watson.
Oh, plenty of bag snatching in the fog.
The London criminal is a dull fellow.
I think it's a very, very good series. I know that he was frustrated with it. I didn't feel I had enough time to do it properly. He's extremely compelling and does dare to show a slightly grumpier, moodier, more introspective side, perhaps before it was really fashionable to do so.
In the most recent television version of Sherlock Holmes, Benedict Cumberbatch's performance is steeped in this sense of melancholy and frustration.
Look at that, Mrs. Hudson. Quiet, calm, peaceful. Isn't it hateful?
Oh, I'm sure something will turn up, Sherlock. A nice murder. That'll cheer you up.
Can't come too soon.
For all the bleakness in Wilmer's performance, on the rare occasion that he allowed Holmes some humour, He was rebuked by a critical television fan base.
Last night, as I watched the 6 Napoleons, I gazed with incredulous horror at you, sir, laughed. But I beg you, sir, if not for your own sake, then for the sake of the man himself, do not show your emotions.
Wilmer's version of Holmes as a brooding, cold-mannered, gothic anti-hero was perhaps too faithful and buttoned up for the 60s pop generation. Sherlock Holmes now came to life in strict cartoons, in league with Superman, and in true comic book style, his arch-villain ceased to be Professor Moriarty and became Jack the Ripper.
The John Neville film, A Study in Terror, there is an American poster where he's called the original Caped Crusader, and it has bow, piff, bang, in a sort of Batman style. And even though the film isn't camp at all, you can sense that they're slightly struggling there with where to place a character who might otherwise feel slightly outdated.
A Study in Terror took Holmes on a far more sexually explicit adventure. These were permissive times, and in 1970, one legendary director finally brought his long-harbored homage of Holmes to the screen. Billy Wilder's The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes set out to explore the emotional and sexual undertones of Holmes's character, to explain his addiction, his misogyny, and give another insight into his relationship with Watson.
That film, it's a masterpiece, I think. It has an amazing bittersweet quality to it. And even though Robert Stevens is a very florid, rather Oscar Wilde-like Holmes, and Colin Blakely, funniest bones you can imagine, they both play it so straight, as well as so funny, that by the time it gets to the desperately moving ending, you're completely with them, you know. I think it's really, really is one of my absolute favourite films, and a pinnacle of Sherlock Holmes movies. It's a very witty film. There's an initial scene when they come back to Baker Street. So you've got Sherlock commenting on this unlikely costume he's been forced to wear, and Watson says, blame it on the illustrator. It's absolutely marvellous.
A bit of poetic license. You saddled me with this improbable costume, which the public now expects me to wear. That is not my doing. Blame it on the illustrator. You've made me out to be a violin virtuoso.
And in this scene, Wilder also wittily probes Holmes' attitude to women and his private vice.
The fact is, I could barely hold my own in the pit orchestra of a second-rate music hall. You're much too modest. You've given the reader the distinct impression that I'm a misogynist. Actually, I don't dislike women. I merely distrust them. The twinkle in the eye and the arsenic in the soup. It's those little touches that make you colourful. Lurid is more like it. You've painted me as a hopeless dope addict just because I occasionally take a 5% solution of cocaine. A 7% solution? 5%. Don't you think I'm aware you've been diluting it behind my back?
Because it's cut down from several other cases to a sort of minor case about a Russian ballerina who wants Holmes to father her child, and then the main case about this spy and the Loch Ness Monster.
Billy said, play it as if you were playing Hamlet. He said, you must play it absolutely seriously. I will make it funny. Don't ever try to be funny. And don't try to tip the wink on anything. But it was his concept of Sherlock Holmes. And I thought a very delightful and affectionate one.
We see Holmes as something other than this rather hard calculating machine. That forensic side of Holmes that you get so strongly in Peter Cushing or in Eileen Norwood is replaced by a figure who's capable of suffering romantic agony. And so you get the possibility of Holmes being in love.
There's this incredible scene where Sherlock tries to get out of fathering the child by claiming that he's gay. Dr. Watson, who is a famous lady killer, is having a wonderful time with all these Russian ballerinas, and then the word spreads about Holmes and Watson's relationship. And as he goes forward in this Russian line, all the girls are replaced by very fey boys. It's just magnificent. And again, really, that's the joke we've run with in our series.
Sherlock, anything on the menu, whatever you want, free, on the house for you and for your date.
Do you want to eat? I'm not his date.
Billy Wilder described his film as a reluctant love story between two men, one being unaware of the other's attraction, later admitting that he'd wished he'd been more daring in making Holmes openly homosexual.
Holmes? Let me ask you a question. I hope I'm not being presumptuous, but there have been women in your life?
The answer is yes. You're being presumptuous.
Whilst Holmes' relationship with Watson remains teasingly ambiguous, Wilder makes the relationship with his brother Mycroft explicitly stormy, pushing the sibling rivalry much further than the original stories. And to play Mycroft, Wilder boldly chose an actor who had become typecast as another great Victorian fictional character, Count Dracula.
The greatest director I've ever worked with. He said to me, I want you to look unlike any other character you've ever played. I don't care what you've done. I want you to be my Mycroft. I think at one point during a rehearsal, we disturbed some bats which flew over. And he kind of looked at me and said, this must make you feel quite at home. Only time.
My version of Mycroft is entirely extrapolated from Christopher Lee's version. And what Billy Wilder did was essentially go one step further than Doyle. By implying that Mycroft was the British government, they implied that that would probably mean he wasn't very nice. And as a sort of uber establishment figure who regards his little brother as something of a loose cannon. But essentially what Mycroft wants to do is to bring him inside the tent. He can't bear the idea that he's got this kind of rogue element with his surname running around in a deerstalker.
Holmes' emotions begin to cloud his judgment. Having come under the spell of the mysterious Madame Valadon, it is left to his elder brother, Mycroft, to reveal to him that she is not all that she seems.
It was essential to keep the information from your client.
You went to all those lengths to prevent Madame Valadon from finding...
Mycroft tells Sherlock Holmes things that Holmes most certainly did not know. He said, you, my dear brother, have been working for the Wilhelmstrasse.
So they enlisted the best brain in England to help them. You, my dear brother, have been working for the Wilhelmstrasse.
Am I going too fast for the best brain in England? So there's very definitely a very competitive streak between the two of them.
The woman who was brought to your house in the middle of the night, apparently fished out of the Thames, and apparently suffering from amnesia, is in fact Ilse von Hofmannsthal, one of their most skillful agents. Am I going too fast for the best brain in England?
And Mycroft is very sarcastic, saying, now this time, I'm the one who really knows what's going on, not you.
They planted her on you quite neatly, I must admit, so that you could lead them to their objective, the air pump. Very much like using a hog to find truffles. And now perhaps you care to join me. I'm expecting a certain royal personage from Balmoral.
Christopher Lee plays it so brilliantly, I think, and it's a very touching performance because although he sort of is disdainful and kowtowing to royalty and everything, it's clear that he does care somewhere deep down in his icy heart. I think he just wants everything to be ordered. That's what he wants. He just wants order. I think really, genuinely, in our increasingly fragmented world, the reason that conspiracy theories are so popular is because we all like to believe there is someone like Mycroft Holmes, because it's actually quite reassuring to think, even if there are dark presence, there is some kind of order. There is none.
The early 1970s were awash with conspiracy theories. This was bizarrely reflected in the letters sent by fans to 221B Baker Street, most of them asking for Holmes to solve a current crisis, like the Watergate scandal, or a plane hijacking, or even rescue Patty Hearst. Amidst this state of paranoia, In August 1974, a young American writer decided to probe Holmes's psyche in what is arguably the best pastiche Holmes novel ever written. The 7% Solution by Nicholas Meyer proved a sensation, remaining on the New York Times bestseller list for 40 weeks, and winning the praise of P.G. Wodehouse, who was lost in admiration for the way in which the young writer had captured Conan Doyle's style.
The 7% Solution was written as a kind of protest against all the Holmes movies and earlier pastiches that I thought, rightly or wrongly, had got it wrong.
Meyer's story, pretending to be a lost manuscript by the late Dr. Watson, promises to solve the mystery of Holmes's missing years after his Reichenbach fall, the solution being that he fetches up in Vienna, where he encounters the father of psychoanalysis, Dr. Sigmund Freud.
Doyle knew about the life and writing of Freud. And I think, oh, they're both doctors. That's kind of interesting. And then I realized that Holmes is a cocaine addict, and Freud had been an early proponent of cocaine, starting as a use of anesthetic during eye surgery, but he also was a user. And a lot of people were very angry at my book because it was a book about an addict. It's not really a Sherlock Holmes story, the 7% Solution. It's a story about Sherlock Holmes, not quite the same. And that Holmes's addiction is something that he has to overcome, and the fact that he does overcome it and function while chained to it renders him more remarkable and not less.
The prospect of this momentous encounter between Holmes and Freud was quickly snapped up by Universal Studios, with a screenplay adapted by Meyer featuring Nicole Williamson and Robert Duvall as Holmes and Watson, together with Alan Arkin as Sigmund Freud.
This is all about a movie about very smart people. Freud's a smart person. Holmes is a very smart person, and Watson is no dummy in this. He's not a buffoon. So the idea of having three actors where you can see the wheels turning, all the three-dimensionality that I hoped was somehow in the book on display.
What was this wickedness?
Under analysis, Freud coaxes the images from Holmes's subconscious and uncovers a deep-rooted family secret that goes a long way to explaining Holmes' mistrust of women.
My mother deceived my father. She had a lover? Yes. And what was the injustice? What was the injustice? He shot her.
Sherlock Holmes goes on the couch. He's analysed by Freud in the 7% Solution. And I think it absolutely reflects people's preoccupations of that moment, that idea of exploring the self, of finding out who you really are, of breaking through the barriers of perception.
And in a rare on-set interview, Nicole Williamson offered a revealing self-analysis of his own.
It's been very difficult sometimes, but the difficulties have been enjoyable because you've had to work your way through them to just let it happen. So therefore, Holmes will be perhaps a lot of me, and therefore, if you don't like my Sherlock Holmes, maybe you don't like me.
Latakia. Many people smoke Turkey cigarettes.
True, but only Turks smoke this brand.
Nicole, who was an enormously gifted man, but a very tormented human being. He was really plagued with all kinds of issues and insecurities and self-doubt, and this little revealing outburst, if you don't like my Holmes, then you don't like me, is probably the cri de coeur of every actor who ever, if you don't like my Hamlet, you're judging me. To find him expressing it, I find especially poignant.
And what can this be? A strand of carpet, also Turkish.
That's the cut.
Although glowingly reviewed by the influential New Yorker film critic Pauline Kael, the 7% solution did not do very well at the box office. It would seem that it caught audiences on the hop, audiences that didn't want to see their heroes with the same neuroses as themselves. By the mid-70s, a Sherlock Holmes revival was well underway. It seemed that he was being played and parodied by everybody, from Gene Wilder to Roger Moore, Christopher Plummer, John Cleese, and even Peter Cook.
Holmes in this movie does have the natural urges of any male. And, thank you, darling. And he does visit a Victorian equivalent of the modern massage parlour.
Yes.
Apart from that?
Apart from that, well,
we haven't departed from the original.
Then what you get in the 80s is Granada coming to this character and deciding to do something self-consciously canonical and definitive, and to, in a way, rescue Holmes from people who had jiggered with him in the past. Because this is the era of quality television, this is the era of Jewel in the Crown and Brideshead Revisited, and those immaculate, faithful, expensive literary adaptations that prove the seriousness of television. And this is what you get with the Granada Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I grew up in Manchester while it was being filmed. I can remember going down to the studio, and before it was open to the public, trying to peer through the railings at Baker Street. And they built this vast set there.
The new, and for many, permanent resident of 221B was Jeremy Brett.
Incidentally, I have glanced over your latest account of my work.
Oh, yes.
Honestly, I cannot congratulate you upon it. Detection is and ought to be an exact science. Observation, deduction, a cold, unemotional subject. You have attempted to tinge it with romanticism, which has much the same effect as if you'd worked a love story or an elopement into the fifth proposition of Euclid. Who can that?
The whole idea of the Granada series was to be as authentic as possible. They even go as far as reproducing the Paget illustrations. And yet Jeremy Brett's performance is a very particular choice. He said himself that he got the kind of manic energy of Sherlock, but he never really captured the idea of the man who would sit for 2 days while his tobacco ash tumbled down his waistcoat, you know. It's a really mannered and rather Victorian performance.
Jeremy's also this creature, this predator that's just lurking underneath this wonderful thing that can turn very owl-like, and then it's hawk-like, and you know, he's very physical and theatrical at times as well, but it's completely contained. It's something that is utterly his own.
In 41 episodes between 1984 and 1994, Jeremy Brett lived the part completely, and like Basil Rathbone, would forever be linked with him.
I think one of the reasons why Jeremy Brett's performance is so definitive is because he's the one who got to do them all. Only Eileen Norwood in the 1920s ever came close. And also because he became so enveloped in the role. He was inescapably Holmes.
He is a dark, recluse, internal creature. And you can only show him through cracks in the marble, glimmers. Yeah. You can't, he's totally internal. And I find that's very hard to sustain.
But as the series wore on, the cracks in the marble became all too apparent.
At the beginning of the series, Jeremy Brett is lithe and athletic, and he's jumping around all the time.
Sorry, Holmes.
No! You couldn't have come at a better time!
But as they go on, he becomes more lethargic, he looks less well. Everything about them seems to be bearing down upon him.
And of course it chimed very strongly with his own personality. And I felt watching him that you were watching somebody who was working out their own demons in public through playing the part.
Jeremy Brett made his last bow as Sherlock Holmes in 1994. He died the following year. He was 61 years old. Brett's legacy was to be for many the complete Sherlock Holmes. Yet, if the screen history tells us anything, it is that Sherlock Holmes is not a fixed point in a changing age, but a protean figure, taking on whatever form his adapters and players want. From Paget's initial branding of his look, to the embellishments on the stage, and the transformations on the screen. Now, a fresh generation of writers and actors are drawing on all these previous incarnations to present us with a new Sherlock for today. And just as he'd done before, the master detective returned from the dead to take on the world again. From 2009, cinema and television audiences have been treated to not one, but two new Sherlocks in the shapes of Benedict Cumberbatch and Robert Downey Jr. Their successes mark a huge revival in the character, not witnessed since the 1970s. In tune with today's vogue for the superhero, Downey Jr. gives us Holmes' Victorian man of action, as in this fight scene where he's able to see in slow motion into the future, a device which has been described by the film's director Guy Ritchie as Holmes-o-vision.
Traumatized solar plexus. Dislocate jaw entirely. Heel kick to diaphragm. In summary, ears ringing, jaw fractured, 3 ribs cracked, 4 broken, diaphragm hemorrhaging. Physical recovery 6 weeks. Full psychological recovery 6 months.
Guy Ritchie offers us a streetwise and swashbuckling Sherlock inhabiting a fantasy Victorian world.
It's a comic strip version of Conan Doyle with lots of technology. It's steampunkish. A kind of comic strip 19th century.
If Downey Jr. is Holmes as a superhero, then Cumberbatch is Holmes as a reluctant one.
I've disappointed you.
It's good. It's good deduction, yeah.
Don't make people into heroes, John. Heroes don't exist, and if they did, I wouldn't be one of them.
Excellent. They are more fallible. It's definitely an uncertain time. I don't think that our Sherlock and John Watson solve everybody's problems. I think they bespeak more of the time we're living in the sense that they're slightly more on the edge.
The latest Sherlocks, like all those that came before them, have been able to reanimate the character for our era, because Sherlock Holmes is a man of many faces, a man who never lived, and so will never die.
4 of them. There's no point sitting at home when there's finally something fun going on.
Look at you all happy. It's not decent.
Who cares about decent? The game, Mrs. Hudson, is on.
Hidden Histories reveals the story behind some of Britain's oldest family businesses here on BBC4 tonight. Parish records and company accounts show how centuries of hard work provide the foundations for our brand new series. Part 1 in just a moment.